change all your life. And I want to say that your desire to learn and lead and act gives me a very strong assurance that our world has a very bright future. So I don't want to start with doom and gloom about climate change, but I would talk a little bit about how we can actually live with it. And I know that you would be leading those efforts for us. So today I would like to talk about climate change scenarios. I know that you all know that climate change is happening, so I don't need to introduce basic science of climate change. And I want to talk about the way how we are experiencing impacts of climate change all around the world and here in Michigan, and how we can go forward from just thinking about those impacts to mapping and measuring and assessing who is vulnerable to climate change and what we can actually do about it. So I will introduce two concepts that you have probably heard before, human vulnerability to climate change and resiliency to climate change. And I will talk a little bit more in depth about various dimensions of vulnerability and resiliency, such as exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to various impacts of climate change. And I will make some connections between climate change adaptation and climate justice. And I would like to save about 10 to maybe 15 minutes just for a conversation. And I would like to know also what you all think about climate change adaptation and climate justice and climate vulnerability. So if at any point you have any questions during my presentations, just go ahead. You don't have to wait all the way till the end unless you want to. I have also just dropped to the chat my email. So if you have like a big question and you want to follow up after this event, you can also write me and I will write you back. So everything that we know about future climate change is really coming from climate models. And we are living at such an interesting time because we are really living on this big crossroad, and depending on what we do right now and what are our climate actions, we can have a terrible future, like described in some dystopian science fiction novels, or we can have a very bright and very sustainable and very positive future, which is still possible for us. And I really want us to focus on what is possible. We should never fall into climate despair. I feel that climate despair can be just as harmful as climate denial. We should always be very hopeful and more than hopeful because we need our energy for acting on climate change. And so what you see on the left of the screen are really different maps of the world that we could experience in the near future, depending on our climate action. And also the SSPs, this new range of scenarios that just came out in the new assessment report, the 6th assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that really tells us very different stories about what can we expect in the future of the world. And if we don't follow with those more positive scenarios, we could have potentially a very bad future, because right now we are dumping huge amount of atmospheric pollution, and you all understand that CO2 and many other greenhouse gases, perhaps except water vapor, those are atmospheric pollutants, and we need to think of them as pollutants, and we need to mitigate these actions. Now, where most of heat trapped by greenhouse gases is going, it's actually going to the ocean, not into the atmosphere. Our climate change would be significantly worse. It will be significantly warmer, and probably our planet would not be livable by now if we were not so lucky to live on the planet where most of it actually consists of the ocean. So 90% of global warming is absorbed by the ocean. And this is great for us. It slows down the warming of the atmosphere. However, The problem is that the ocean is also changing as a result of warming, and many things are changing in the ocean, starting with the fact that as it's becoming warmer, it causes thermal expansion. So this is one of the two reasons of sea level rise. The other one, of course, the melting glaciers. The ocean is also becoming more acidic as a result of this. And as the ocean is warming, it also is becoming less powerful carbon sink. So ocean is taking lots of heat. It's also taking lots of carbon from the atmosphere. It really helps us to process all this carbon pollution. But at a certain point, the ocean wouldn't be able to take as much carbon and as much heat. And so I just want to bring to your attention this, I think, terrific metaphor, very scary, but really helping us to think of ocean heating, comparing it to Hiroshima bombs explosions. And so think of the ocean heating rate as 4 Hiroshima bombs explosions per second. This is how much heat is going to the ocean as a result of climate change. And this, of course, leads to the changes in the ocean currents and many, many other things that can continue many, many years and even centuries beyond even our best climate action. So even if right now we could stop climate change, many of those processes will still continue, unfortunately. Like there is nothing that we can do, for example, to stop sea level rise, unfortunately, even with the best possible climate change mitigation. So I want us to think about some examples of climate change impacts on different parts of the world. Some of them are biophysical, they're very straightforward. We understand immediately how they're happening. For example, sea level rise or changing in the ocean currents or changes in our weather systems, wildfires and so on. So those are kind of the direct impacts of climate change on different parts of our climate system. But there are also many much more complex socioeconomic impacts of climate change, including impacts on food security, creating massive insecurity in many parts of the world, creating water shortages, causing human displacement. We have more and more climate migration, which is happening already from areas that are under the sea. Literally, as we speak, there are parts of the world that would be more and more vulnerable as a result of this. And so there are somewhat less even direct impacts of climate change that we are experiencing increasing rates of cardiovascular diseases. There are some studies suggesting that higher concentrations of carbon dioxide are also promoting certain types of cancer. And then we also have increasing rates of anxiety and depression, also related to our thoughts about climate change. So this is also not very healthy for us all the time. Think about what might happen. And so there are really this overwhelming, I'm sure you all are following the news, and you might be also just as overwhelmed as everybody else and as myself, thinking about tornadoes and hurricanes and flooding and forest fires and many, many other impacts. Think of impacts of climate change on infrastructure, for example, as climate change is causing thawing of permafrost, permanently frozen soils, or as a change in our seasons. It also changes the structure of soils. So we see lots of disruption of our infrastructure in many parts of the world. And so this really brings me to the first concept of our conversation today, is the concept of vulnerability. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, defines vulnerability in very simple terms. It's a propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. And it can be adversely affected, you can just fill the blank. And in this case, we are talking about various impacts of climate change. We can be vulnerable to floods. We can be vulnerable to wildfires. We can be vulnerable to vector-borne diseases and many other of those impacts that you saw on the previous screen. And vulnerability depends on many things, not only biophysical factors. It also depends very much on where we are, who we are, what kind of resources we have, what kind of support systems we have, what kind of networks we are benefiting from. And so what you see on my screen is the Arkema chemical plant in Houston, Texas, which was flooded and exploded in 2017 after the Hurricane Harvey. And I want to remind you, when Hurricane Harvey happened in 2017, the National Weather Services had to redo their maps. They did not have the color to put on the map the amount of precipitation that fell on Houston, because it has never happened before, ever. So they had to redesign the legend of the map to show how much rainfall was there. And that was really a devastating event. I had a very close friend living in Houston, and I went to visit him straight, like after the hurricane, when it was possible to travel. And he was fine. He was just kind of stranded in his apartment on the second floor, and he, had where they were rationed to 2 bottles of water for a long period of time. And but they were fine. He couldn't drive for a long time, of course. But there were many people who died. There were many people who lost everything. There were many people who are still struggling with the consequences of Hurricane Harvey 5 years later, because Houston is also in the center of petrochemical industry, and it's extremely prone to pollution from oil-less chemical plants that are located there. So this pollution is still there, making people who live there extremely vulnerable. Now, sort of on the flip side, on the bright side of vulnerability, there is resiliency. And you have probably heard both terms, resiliency and resilience, with E at the end or with Y at the end. They're both absolutely correct and are used interchangeably. The academic community, the scientists, I usually use the word resiliency, and resilience is just the everyday term. So think about it, fairness versus equity or justice, right? Like resilience or resiliency. And resiliency to climate change is really the ability to recover and bounce back. It's not about stopping climate change. It's not even about adapting climate change. It's just about how we can live through climate change impacts and still thrive and still be okay and still bounce back. And so there are really many very exciting ideas related to resiliency, and more cities around the world develop their resiliency plans. So here, just one of the ideas from the Netherlands, one of the suburbs of Amsterdam are called Ichburg, is building these floating houses on the ocean. And of course, the Netherlands is the second most vulnerable country in the world, actually, to the sea level rise. And so Dutch people have been living with the sea and flooding for many centuries, and have developed lots of knowledge about adapting to sea level rise even before the human-induced climate change came. And so there's some really interesting ideas about what we can do to become more resilient. Now, becoming resilient and becoming less vulnerable can come in many forms and many shapes. And you have probably heard before, we are all here in the same boat because of the climate change. And there's probably no other slogan that irritates me more than this one, because I would say that we are all in the same storm, but unfortunately, we are not all in the same boats, because the same climate impact has very different implications and very different vulnerability, depending on where we are, who we are, and what resources we have. And we have so many structural inequalities in our society here in the United States, but also pretty much everywhere around the world, that these structural inequalities, this uneven access to resources, uneven access to healthcare, uneven access to education, uneven access to insurance, and many other resources that people need, creates this very different degrees of vulnerability and what can be just, kind of unknown situation for one person who has to move from their house to spend a couple of nights in the hotel could actually be a tragedy at the level of the difference of life and death for another person who doesn't have those resources. So human vulnerability can be thought in terms of combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Let's think for a moment about these three variables, and vulnerability is a function of all the three. And it positively correlates with exposure. It's negatively correlates with sensitivity. It positively correlates with sensitivity, and it's negatively correlates with adaptive capacity. And let's see why. So let's think for a moment about all of us being exposed to flooding. Let's say there is a big flooding in Battle Creek. So depending on where your house is, what is the elevation, what is the terrain, what is the type of soils, your house can be vulnerable or your house might be not vulnerable. It really depends on where you are. It's kind of the pure physical geography, of how much you are influenced by this adverse impact. But even if we all are experiencing exactly the same exposure, we might still live this through the experience of this flood very differently, depending on our age, depending on our gender, our health conditions, wellness, fitness, our lifestyle, and many other things. So some of you probably remember that last summer, there were tremendous floods in Detroit, and Detroit has very high exposure to flooding because it's kind of low-lying terrain, very close to the lake, in the mouth of the river. So it is very prone to flooding. And so for many people who had very high sensitivity because of their living conditions, these floods were very, very devastating. And then we have the adaptive capacity. That is another also purely socioeconomic dimension of vulnerability, including things such as how much money we have, what kind of information we use, what kind of education we have, do we have transportation, do we have access to insurance, do we know what is the evacuation plan in the area where we live, and many other resources. And so again, think about this flooding in Detroit, when there were people who were stranded in the middle of the pandemic, struggling with unemployment, struggling with food security, struggling with the lack of access to the healthcare at the same time as they were hit by this very severe flooding. I want to bring us to another case study, and it's very familiar to all of you. It was all over the news just 2 years ago, flooding in the Midland County here in Michigan, in Midland. And so this happened May 17, when Midland experienced really outrageous amount of precipitation, also clearly related to increase of precipitation due to climate change in Michigan. So more than 4 inches just fell across Midland in 48 hours. And so about 10,000 residents had to be immediately evacuated. So what you see here is on the top of the screen is the situation just before the flooding, and then all this mud that you see on the satellite imagery, essentially, that's what happened after the dams broke. So the Edenville Dam collapsed in May 19, sending huge amount of flood water across the landscape, and then the Sanford Dam further flooded the entire surrounding area. So many people had to be evacuated. Again, think of this, that happened just in the middle of the lockdown in 2020, when we were still trying to understand what COVID-19 is. And I want us just to pause for a second and think how this experience of this 10,000 or more people in Midland who were evacuated in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of this really devastating event, how it affected different groups of people. So, let's just all, you can drop your thoughts into the chat, or, you can intervene, or we can talk about it later, but let's just think, like, what if you are, a woman who is expecting a baby, in the middle of everything is going on? Or what if you are, a young parent with a newborn child, or maybe you are a homeless person, maybe you have no place to go. What about people with chronic health conditions who need access to electricity all the time, who need to be on the life support? What about people who are marginalized? What about people who are discriminated? So let's just, kind of take a moment and think of this. And we can come back to the slide at the end if we have time for the discussion. But I want now to give you some tools helping us to measure all this information. So there are ways actually to measure and map and assess this information about different dimensions of vulnerability in order to make good adaptation planning decisions. And so the concept of vulnerability scoping diagram kind of brings together exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, where each of them can be measured, is very helpful, because then we can compare different locations based on their demographics, based on the socioeconomic profiles of their population, based on their physical geography, and compare why and understand much better why they're vulnerable and who is vulnerable. One place, so here we have a comparison of two counties, or one on the Gulf Coast, another one in mid-Atlantic region. And you can see that they both have a kind of low severity of vulnerability, but it comes for different reasons. And so we can kind of decompose different variables and quantify them and put numbers, like you can measure income, you can measure infrastructure, you can measure frequency of wildfires, you can measure precipitation. So it kind of gives you an idea how you can create mathematical metrics in order to describe this event and provide really useful information for planners. Now, my research has been focusing on climate adaptation planning in small cities. So many cities are thinking more and more about how to adapt to climate change. We need to live with impacts of climate change. Even with the best climate change mitigation option, we still need to adapt. And so many big cities, many really large cities, mega cities now have very good climate adaptation plans. Like New York has, several volumes of climate adaptation plan. Chicago has a fabulous climate adaptation plan. San Francisco, many cities around the world, like Paris, Rotterdam, Vancouver, and so on. But what about the small cities? What about cities like Battle Creek? We also need to have climate adaptation plans. And so I have been looking at the experience of small cities all across the United States, trying to find out how cities are measuring their vulnerability to climate change and what they do about it, and how they are planning their actions to adapt. And so we can think about different types of adaptation. We can develop green infrastructure. Adaptation is in housing. Adaptation can be in public utilities. Adaptation can be in food systems, in air quality, in community education. And so I'm working through this project and looking at 12 different domains of adaptation, exploring how cities are measuring their vulnerability and what kind of actions they propose. I'm also very much interested in diversity of stakeholders who are involved, who is involved in climate adaptation planning, to what extent the citizens of those cities actually have something to say and contribute to the planning of the actions that they would like to see in their cities. And so what I am finding is showing that, look, we're doing some progress, but this progress is certainly not going fast enough. All the cities are thinking about exposure, and this is good. You can see that every single adaptation plan here is has something to say about their exposure to climate impacts. unfortunately, and this is very, very, very troubling for me, that to see that not all cities yet understand that sensitivity and adaptive capacity is not the same for all of their residents. And so you can see that some cities are doing tremendous job, and others are still kind of figuring it out. When we compare what is the level of inclusion and what is the level of diversity of different groups of stakeholders involved in climate adaptation planning, we also see a very broad range from cities who are very, very inclusive to cities who are not inclusive at all. And this leads to fairly different outcomes when it comes to consideration of equity in climate adaptation planning. So here you see kind of the equity measured as percentage. And so you see that, you know, like there's a number of cities that really, really do wonderful work, you know, specifically developing climate adaptation measure that would make this adaptation measures fair and equitable, and making sure that vulnerable populations are protected. But you also see how quickly this graph is declining from that handful of cities who are really doing a very good job to climate adaptation plans that only have like 10% or 12% of attention to equity. And ask me more if you want to know more. Now, on the positive side, cities are doing better. So what you see here is the timeline of changes in the inclusion of stakeholders, diversity, but also attention to equity in climate adaptation plans over time. And I have been looking at all climate adaptation plans in small cities from the very, very first climate adaptation plan. So the very first city in the United States who developed climate adaptation plan was Keene, New Hampshire. That was the very first climate adaptation plan ever in the United States, and it was developed in 2007. And so you can see that since that time, many more cities have developed, many small cities have developed their climate adaptation plans, and the size of the bubble represents how much attention they put to equity in their adaptation measures. So there's definitely some improvement that we can see. To sum up, you know, some closing thoughts on this. It's important to understand that various counties, various countries, various states, various communities, various groups of population, and even various individuals are affected by impacts of climate change and extreme events very, very unevenly. So not everybody is experiencing the same impacts in the same way. And vulnerability of already vulnerable groups, such as infants and elderly, and people with disabilities, and people of color, and other people who are facing discrimination, you know, either based on their gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity or immigration status. Their vulnerability is unfortunately likely to increase unless we can put in place equitable adaptation measures. And this is something that needs to happen pretty much right now. Climate adaptation planning is a very important emerging planning field. Its importance is, I'm sure, only is going to increase in future as our society is experiencing more and more impacts of climate change. And so many cities and many counties around the United States and also worldwide are looking for the climate adaptation professionals. So if you are thinking about your future career, consider climate adaptation planning very seriously. And so here in the United States, we clearly see very significant correlation between the inclusion of diverse stakeholders and higher consideration of equity in climate adaptation plans. The more diverse the groups who are working on climate adaptation, the more likely they are to think about equity and fairness and justice in their climate adaptation plans. And there are similar findings in other countries as well. So I work with my French colleague, and we have done comparative studies of climate adaptation plans between France and the United States, and we have some very similar findings. Finally, I wanted to let you know that at GVSU, we have developed a degree in, it's an emphasis in the bachelor's degree in geography, in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency planning. So this is the first program in the state of Michigan. And if you are considering GVSU as your future college destination, you can find more information on our website, or you can email me. I'm an advisor for this program, and I would love to talk to you and tell you more. And of course, there are so many employment opportunities in this area right now. So thank you very much for listening. Here is my contact information. I am a coordinator of GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network, so I have also dropped this website in the chat, where you can find lots of additional information about climate change, including videos on climate change education and climate change adaptation. Well, thank you very much, and I am ready for your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you make equitable adaptation measures.
So yeah, this is a great question. And in our experience, both based on the literature and based on my empirical study in the United States and also studies in Europe, we found that there is a very strong correlation between the diversity of stakeholders and ability of the local governments to propose and develop equitable adaptation measures. And it's especially important to involve voices of the most marginal groups, right? You know, we really, if we develop our climate adaptation plan from the kind of upper middle class perspective, it's very easy to overlook the experience of those who are the most vulnerable to climate change. So these vulnerable groups, these vulnerable voices absolutely need to be at the table of climate planning. And this is true both nationally and locally and internationally. So, you know, I am looking at the local adaptation plans, but, you know, think about climate vulnerability worldwide, right? There is a huge inequality between different countries, different regions, and the countries who are the most vulnerable to climate change, those are not necessarily the countries who are contributing most of the emissions. You know, the per capita emissions in developing countries are very, very low, but those are the countries who are also experiencing the most devastating impacts of climate change. And the same is true at the local scale. You know, like, who is the most vulnerable in Michigan? You know, people who are homeless, people who are living in shelters, you know, people who don't have personal transportation. So what is their carbon footprint? It's absolutely tiny. They are not responsible for global warming. They're not responsible in any way for climate change. And so these people are actually the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. So this is, for me, this is a question of fairness. This is a question of climate justice and social justice. And unless we address this, we cannot address climate change.
I guess you talked about it a little bit, but how do you reconcile making changes to be more equitable when the people producing lots of climate or like carbon dioxide are not those affected by the climate change?
So I would say that we need to probably start by the recognition of those inequalities, right? And one of the ways of how we can probably bring everybody to the same denominator is to start carbon pricing. You know, we need to establish very clear carbon pricing rules so that those who pollute, those who contribute the most to climate change could pay and contribute to the measures alleviating climate change. And also we need to work on social programs that would lift the burden of climate change from the most vulnerable groups. And this can be done, through housing programs, through access to the healthcare, through free access to education, and many, many other measures. So I think by decreasing inequality in our society in general, we are also reducing this, very unequal patterns of vulnerability to climate change.
All right, and then the next question asks, how do we as high school students bring attention to those who are vulnerable as a citizen of one of the largest countries which contribute to climate emissions?
Oh, thank you. Great question. Well, first of all, I wanted to say you are already doing this, right? By hosting this symposium and by bringing so many different voices, you're already doing a terrific job. But to follow up, my answer is the same. We need to bring everybody to the table and especially give voice to those who usually don't have it. We need to bring those most vulnerable groups to the conversation about climate change. And so I really commend you on the list of speakers, also on alignment of the sessions in this symposium. You balance extremely well, the stream on climate science with conversation on climate justice and climate policy. I think it's very, very important. And I would just encourage you to continue bringing different speakers, including the most vulnerable groups.
All right, thank you. And then do you have any advice for students who are looking to get into this? I know that you mentioned the program that they're having at GVSU. Could you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Yes, absolutely. So this would be really my great pleasure. So we developed this program 3 years ago, and this is a part of geography and sustainable planning major. So we have 4 different emphasis areas in geography, including environment and global development, sustainable urban and regional planning, geospatial technology, and then our newest is climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency planning. And so if you decide to come to GVSU and major in one of these 4 areas, but especially mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, you would be learning both about climate science and about urban planning. So focus is very much on solutions. I think solutions, like we really need to think right now about climate solutions. I want again to emphasize, it's not time for despair. It's time for building much better future. And so you will be learning a lot about things such as green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. You will be learning about sustainability. You will be learning about climate resiliency. You will be also taking some GIS classes, geographic information systems, learning how to map this information and use your computer to integrate different sources of data. And if you have any, actually, if you go to the website that I showed on my screen, you can even see the navigation through the degree, so it will give you an idea of what kind of classes you are going to take. And I think this is a very, very needed area. Many cities in Michigan are developing their climate adaptation plans, like the city of Grand Rapids is working on its climate adaptation plan. Detroit has climate adaptation plan. Flint is developing it. So it's really everywhere. And of course, it's also all over the country. So yes, it's time to, it's a very good time for learning about climate adaptation planning.
Wonderful. So it looks like there's no more questions at this time, but thank you so much for coming in and sharing your expertise with us. This was a very interesting presentation. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, wonderful. And then for any of our attendees, the next session will start in about 20 minutes, and I can drop the link in the chat for that one too. It's going to be our closing panelists. Oh, never mind. It looks like we do have another question. Sorry. So it says, I know that a lot of places have climate plans. What are your advice for making sure that those get followed through on?
So yeah, this is an excellent question. One thing is planning, the other is implementation. And so one things to look at in those climate action plans and climate adaptation plans is to make sure they have a clear implementation plan and that the community is following through. And I know that a number of cities are going through already the second or third iteration of their adaptation plans. Boulder should just develop a new adaptation plan. There is a number of cities in California. I do believe that cities need very strong support of their states and also support of local universities, because they need lots of climate data, but also demographic data and economic data and environmental data. And this is why I think collaboration between the local governments and the state government and the universities is very, very important, because cities are not necessarily climate experts, so they need climate services, they need climate tools, they need information to develop good climate adaptation plans. And some places are doing better than others. So I am very impressed by the experience of climate adaptation planning in California. And California has lots of tools for cities and for citizens available online. If you can go yourself online and take a look at CalAdapt. California Adapts, and there's lots of resources for citizens to engage in climate adaptation planning. And I am also very hopeful that we will have excellent climate adaptation plans here in Michigan. We are going right now through the development of healthy climate plan for the state, and it's very important that we will continue improving our resiliency here in Michigan. And thank you for this excellent question.
Yes, we're so glad. It looks like there are no more questions. So again, thank you so much for coming. And it looks like we'll have about 15 minutes before our next presentation, and that will be the panelists. Let me find that link for you.
And pleasure. It's wonderful to be with you.
Yes, thank you so much. All right.